Hi, everyone. My name is Lily Woon. I'm the National Chair of Young Women in Bio, and it's so great to have all of you join today. We have a really fascinating talk. We are working with the Broad Institute on a number of initiatives, and today members of the Broad team have joined us today to talk about a very special and very interesting study. And it's called the NeuroGAP-Psychosis, Mental Health, Genetics, and Equity and Partnership in Science. And we're really excited to hear more about this talk. And before I turn it over to Tom, I just wanted to mention that Young Women in Bio, we're part of Women in Bio. We focus on young girls from elementary school all the way to sophomore year in college. And we try to help these girls pursue their interest in STEM and give them an idea of all the opportunities that are out there for them. And with that, I turn it over to Tom Ulrich, who is the Associate Director of Science Education at the Broad Institute.
Thank you very much, Lily, and good morning to everybody who's joining us on the webinar today. As Lily said, my name is Tom. I'm the Associate Director for Science Communications at the Broad. Really briefly, I started out my career actually training to be a microbiologist. Thought I would go out into the field looking for new viruses, but about 20 years ago decided that I was much happier talking about and writing about science than actually doing it. Since then, I've worked in many areas of science communications, including philanthropy, marketing, public relations, and science writing. And for about 5 years now, I've been working at the Broad Institute. Joining me today are 3 members of the NeuroGAP-Psychosis study team: Anne Stevenson, who works at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and at the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad, and is the program manager for NeuroGAP-Psychosis. Edith Kwoba, who is a psychiatrist and the head of mental health at Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital in Eldoret, Kenya, and is a co-investigator on NeuroGAP-Psychosis. And Zuki Zingela, who is a psychiatrist and the chair of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Walter Sisulu University and Nelson Mandela Academic Hospital in Matata, South Africa, and who is the principal investigator for the NeuroGAP-Psychosis site there. So you've heard this word NeuroGAP-Psychosis a few times now, and what does that mean? So the name is short for Neuropsychiatric Genetics in African Populations - Psychosis. It's a research partnership that brings together scientists from Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, Uganda, and the US to study the genetics of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in people from Africa. And in a minute, Edith is going to explain to us why it's important to be studying psychosis in these populations. The project aims to recruit about 35,000 people from across the 4 African nations, and it's also to help train new scientists in each nation to study psychiatric genetics and build research capacity there in other ways as well. Before we dive into the video portion of the day, we figured it would be good to give all of you a little bit of background, both into the diseases that we're studying and why it's important to study them in these populations. And so I was going to ask Zuki if you could, A, tell us a little bit about yourself, and B, tell us a little bit about schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
As Tom has indicated, I'm one of the principal investigators on the NeuroGAP study, and I'm one of the South African partners, there being 2, one with my university at Walter Sisulu University and the other one being University of Cape Town. So just a little bit of background about myself. I'm a medical doctor by profession who then went on to specialize in mental health disorders. And that, of course, is a specialist psychiatrist by profession when one has finished specializing. And that means, therefore, that I deal with not only medical problems, but also mental health problems in a clinical setting. In addition, I am in an academic, I would call it setting, in that I'm chair of my department at the university, responsible for teaching undergraduate students who are just starting off as, students in the medical sciences or studying to become doctors. And then in addition, I also teach students who are postgraduate, that is, they are already qualified as doctors, and then they want to specialize in psychiatry. So that would be someone called a resident in the US. So I take responsibility for both categories of students. And then in addition, I have to supervise them when they do research, as well as conduct my own research. And I would say what pushed me into this area of research is seeing that in addition to what we can offer as clinicians on the floor who deal directly with people who suffer from mental illness, we also have quite a few questions that have remained unanswered, which obviously would make a difference to what we could do for patients if we knew those answers. Enter then a project like NeuroGAP, which basically came with an offer to say, with these two serious mental disorders which can manifest or present with psychosis, if we can gather specimens from so many thousands of people, we might be able to go and look at these specimens in the lab, do some genetic sequencing and analysis, and maybe come up with clues about what causes these serious mental disorders. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about, when we're talking psychotic disorders, we're talking about disorders that affect a person so significantly or severely that they lose touch with reality. Where reality for you and me seems straightforward and obvious, and we hardly doubt what we are experiencing. When one is suffering from either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, that ability to tell the difference between what is real and what is not can be affected. For example, if we take bipolar disorder, that is a mood disorder, meaning it affects how you feel, but more over and above affecting how you feel, it also affects how you think, how you experience the world, how you perceive it, and the things you might end up believing as a result of probably your perceptions or probably other things going wrong because of the bipolar illness. Somebody with bipolar illness can then have episodes when they depress or when they become really depressed to the point where they can lose touch with reality or become psychotic, or they can also have other disturbances of mood where they may appear quite ecstatic, happy, speaking very fast, speaking a lot, not sleeping, and really doing very impulsive things that could place them in danger. So what we then would see as psychotic in somebody with bipolar disorder is when they, in addition to the symptoms of either depression or being quite high, they may start hearing voices that other people cannot hear. They may also start believing things that are obviously untrue to those around them, but they would still not be able to differentiate that those things they believe are not true. So in summary, that is bipolar disorder. And part of the reason it is so important to treat illnesses like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia is if we do not treat these illnesses, then people tend to suffer, they tend to not function at their optimal best, and you may find that their ability to attend to their schooling responsibilities or their college responsibilities or even career responsibilities, all of that is impaired. And if I then move on to schizophrenia, again, the biggest problem there is that it is a chronic mental illness potentially, meaning it can go on for a long time. And then in addition, you will also find that there is a tendency to lose touch with reality that can manifest in behavior that other people around the person suffering from schizophrenia may define as odd. It can manifest in that person with schizophrenia hearing sounds or voices that other people cannot hear. It can manifest in disturbed thinking, where the person with schizophrenia starts to believe all sorts of things which might be scary. It might make them feel hunted or persecuted. And over time, you may find that it becomes very difficult for them to actually continue living their usual normal life or performing their usual normal duties. If we look at both bipolar and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, we'll find that in terms of how frequently they occur, if you take any given population, whether it is in the US or it is in Kenya, where it is, or it's in South Africa, you will find 1% of the population suffers from both these illnesses. 1% for schizophrenia and 1% for bipolar disorder. So if you think to yourself, that doesn't sound like a big percentage, why then are we investing so much effort in it? The reason we invest so much effort in it is typically both these illnesses can start at a time when a person is supposed to be very productive. That can be in your late teens, that can be in your early 20s, and you may have other waves that start a little bit later, but the common age group is usually late teens and early 20s. Now, what you find is that when people start suffering from these illnesses, it can be so significant and so debilitating at times that it literally interrupts their normal life. It may result in some of them not being able to continue with their education. It may result in some people not being able to actually secure a job, or even after they've secured a job, they may not be able to hold it down for very long. It can also result in disturbed relations with family. It can result in disturbed relations with those around you who might be friends. So therefore, we advocate to make sure that people get the interventions that they need. The other disadvantage we have is, although we've got a number of clues about the causes of these different illnesses, but you find that we do not have all the answers. We may know what goes wrong in the brain, but we may not necessarily know what kicks off or kickstarts the process where people start experiencing this illness, which is where then the genetic studies and sequencing comes in, because we are actually trying to look for the core causes of these disorders. And the hope is, if we're able to identify the core causes, it might actually lead us to better treatments that would then hopefully result in better outcomes for people with schizophrenia. One thing that we do try and do is, in the treatments that we have currently, we try and focus a lot on the most debilitating symptoms so that the person can recover or at least go into remission. When we're talking about going into remission, we mean that all the symptoms have settled and the person can return to their usual level of functioning. It does, however, happen sometimes that even though we may be successful at treating some of these symptoms, we may not always be successful at treating all of them, which is why, therefore, the kind of study or the kind of opportunities to learn about these disorders that the NeuroGAP project presents is an unmissable one. And lastly, I also want to add that if we look at the amount of information that we know about these disorders, especially when we look at the underlying possible genetic causes of these disorders, we clearly do not know half enough of what we need to know. And the main reason for that is because previous studies have been done in only a select few in terms of the different populations we have across the world. And the difference, therefore, with NeuroGAP is that we are aiming to include more and more diverse populations in order to try and get to the answer. I'm going to stop there for now and hand over back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Suki. That was a great explanation of why these conditions are so important for people to be studying. Edith, building on what Suki was just talking about, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the need for diversity in the data and our understanding genetically of how schizophrenia and bipolar disorder come about and the genetic roots of these conditions. And also tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I want to thank Zuki for starting us off. About myself, I'm a psychiatrist, to mean that I am a medical doctor who practiced. Actually, in Kenya, we are allowed to practice for a few years after our undergraduate training before we go back to school. So I graduated from my, we call it MD, from my medicine training in 2007, worked until 2010, and returned to school for another 3 years to specialize in psychiatry. So since 2013, I've now been practicing as a psychiatrist. And I currently work in a national teaching and referral hospital somewhere in Western Kenya. And among the many things that I do, one, I am an administrator heading the mental health department since 2014. I also see patients every day, ward rounds, clinics. And I also teach different students, some at Moi University, where we are doing the NeuroGAP study. And I also teach on part-time basis for other universities like Kabarak University. And one other thing that I love to do is really community outreach projects to make sure that in a context where we have limited human resource for mental health, I am able to somehow build capacity for primary care workers and nurses and clinical officers, equivalent to nurse assistants, to be able to manage patients, even if it's basic, very basic form of management, while at the same time exploring how to refer these patients. Why is that important? The importance of that is that in our setting, people have to travel long distances to seek psychiatric care, and that's very costly. And because of issues like limited resources, financially, some people choose to keep patients with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses at home. So when you build capacity at the primary care, then people have an increased chance of at least getting care. As far as NeuroGAP is concerned, I am a co-investigator. I've been working with Professor Lukoya at Wally, mostly assisting him in ensuring the implementation of the project. So I've participated in training the research assistants and continuous supervision on the ground. Like I'm the immediate supervisors of those who are collecting data and things like that. So as far as data diversity is concerned, I like that Zuki already expounded on that for the longest time, a lot of research for different reasons have been carried out in resource-rich settings, and therefore, Africa being one of the resource-limited settings, there hasn't been too much research generally, not just genetic research, but more importantly, genetic research, because as we progress, we know that in future, the drugs that are going to be developed and the ability to establish specific disease risk factors will be based on the genetic studies we are doing. And that is why we are involved in the NeuroGAP study, because one of the things, one of the observations, especially after one big genetic research study, to call it that way, the Human Genome Project that many of us might have heard about, that was done, and it included many people of the European ancestry. They thought that they had actually drafted the first book of human life because they thought they had figured it out. But what followed after that is a lot of challenges. People try to challenge that data and try to see whether it was actually inclusive. And what they established is that African Americans and the Latinos and the Spanish had some differences. And what that means is that in future, if you use the findings like of the Human Genome Project, and you didn't include the Africans and other people, the different ancestries, the truth is the drugs you develop or the risk factors that you understand from that genetic finding, they may not be representative. And therefore, the reason why NGAP or NeuroGAP study is here is to ensure that whatever data comes out of this research, especially because we believe that in future, the risk for schizophrenia might just be predicted from the genetic studies, whether one is at risk, and the drugs that will be developed for schizophrenia and bipolar mood disorder, again, will be dependent on the genetic findings that we have now. We want to be a bit precise when that happens, so that we will not be assuming that research that was done in the US or in Europe or other places can actually be applicable in Africa. We will be confident that because the Africans were involved in the study, then that drugs likely will work, or that kind of prediction for risk factor for mental illness will actually be precise. And that is why it is very important that today the Africans are involved in that study that we believe will play a big role in shaping the future of management of mental illness, including schizophrenia and bipolar mood disorder. Thank you. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Edith. That was a great explanation. So with that all in mind, the question is, why are we all here today? And I'm going to share a couple of slides that I hope will help illustrate that. Okay. So about 2 or so years ago, Anne approached me with a question. Would the Broad Communications Office be willing to send me and one of our videographers with her on a site visit to a couple of the NeuroGAP-Psychosis sites to see the work being done there. I had first written about NeuroGAP-Psychosis for the Broad website probably about a year or so before, but it was largely from the North American perspective. Anne wanted us to see the African side of the story and the work being done on the ground. So what you're going to see this morning are the fruits of what eventually turned into a 2-week-long reporting trip, which videographer Russ Marakver, who you can see in the slides, and I took to Kenya and Uganda in November of 2019. Now, I want to make sure you understand that it's unusual for an institution like ours to send a video team overseas. It's the kind of thing that a news outlet would usually do, but not a research institution. But our leadership recognized the importance of the work and felt strongly that this was a story that we needed to be telling. So in a few minutes, what you're going to be seeing is a series of videos documenting the work being done at NeuroGAP-Psychosis sites in Kampala, Uganda, and Eldoret, Kenya. You'll be meeting several members of the study team, and you'll also be meeting some of the young researchers that are being trained through the project. We're going to show the videos in 2 groupings with a break for a couple of questions in between, followed by additional Q&A time at the end. Feel free at any point to drop questions into the Zoom Q&A box. Lily will be moderating both Q&As, and she'll be putting the questions to Anne, Edith, Zuki, or me during the Q&A portions of the session. We hope you enjoy everything, and we look forward to your questions. And I'm just going to take a second here to share now the first video. Here we go.
You have been invited to take part in this research study. The study wants to find out if this is genetic, like is it inherited from our parents and great-great-parents, okay?
So for the NeuroGAP study, we collect saliva and then extract DNA from it. And once we've extracted DNA from it, we have the cases, we have the controls, so we match them for age, ethnicity, and we're hoping to see differences between these populations. And those results should be able to tell us whether some of the mental illnesses or some of the mental disorders that we see have any hereditary traits or rationale behind them.
Working with our networks across the African continent, we managed to bring together a team from Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, and set up a project that set for itself ambitious targets of reaching more than 30,000 people across the continent, collecting samples, but also contributing to the neuropsychiatric research environment in those countries, in the hope that the work that we would do would not only contribute to the global database, but would also leave sustainable footprints in the areas that we are working in, improving the research infrastructure, improving care for our patients with chronic severe illness, and also improving the profile of mental health interventions in our countries.
It has a capacity building part, and it has very interesting interactions and collaborations between the people in the Eastern Hemisphere and the ones in the Western Hemisphere, across the Atlantic. Yep.
NeuroGAP should be that beacon that reminds the global scientific community that equity is also a consideration in research, and we shouldn't only be focusing on our small corners of the globe.
In most African communities, mental health is considered a disease that is not treatable, and people are not free about it. We still hold it as a mysterious issue. It's like a taboo, and people may not wish to mix so much with people with mental illness.
We know that Africa is where modern humans originated from. And there's not a lot of work that has been done regarding the genetics of anything in the African population, let alone mental illness.
Treatments for mental illnesses across the world are inadequate. The medications that are there, the interventions that are there, only scrape the surface. They do not address the problems fundamentally.
Stigma towards mental health in general is a significant barrier towards the achievement of integration of mental health care into our primary health care system.
We are in a setting where people understand illness as fever, a swelling, a wound, or the general ways of defining illness.
When you do not have adequate mechanisms of diagnosis and treatment of any severe chronic illness, then stigma takes root, and people believe in the stigmatizing attitudes.
There's not a lot of understanding in terms of science as to the relationship between behavior and the brain itself as an organ, as having an illness. When you have a brain tumor, people understand, but when you have a mental illness, people don't understand. So that kind of complicates how we see it as a society.
It's important to study genetics among Africans as regards psychosis, because much of the research has occurred out of Africa, and yet we know we are really quite genetically very different.
The evidence suggests that the amount of genetic diversity on the African continent is greater than anywhere else in the world. And we seem to be reaching agreement now that a lot of the answers will be found in the genetic makeup of the people. When we started thinking about the complexion of the global neuropsychiatric genetics database, we all agreed in the field that this database was not representative of the world's populations. Most of the samples were from Caucasian populations and maybe a little from parts of Asia, but they did not look the same as what the world's population looks like.
If we are going to make medications that are meant or tailored towards certain genetic variations, then we need to involve populations from Africa in this kind of work. Now, if we don't do that, then the African continent and its inhabitants will continue to lag behind.
And that's the first video. Lily, over to you for questions.
Thanks, Tom. So we received a few questions, and I'm just going to read them out loud and then refer them to one of you to answer. But before I start that, I thought, Anne, since you're the program director, would you mind saying a few words as to why and how you came up with this study and how you developed it, and why you brought in these particular scientists, Edith and Zuki?
Thanks. So I definitely cannot take credit for coming up with it or designing it, but I can tell you a little bit about how it came to be. I think, so I'm the program director. I've been working on this study for 5 years. And I think where the study came from is Kirsten Conan, who is the PI at Harvard School of Public Health and the Broad Institute, and Steve Hyman, who's the head of the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute, recognized many years ago that there's a real lack of diversity in genetics research, and particularly, like, even more so in mental health genetics. And even though we recognize that, it's very hard to actually change that. It takes a huge study. This study is aiming to recruit 35,000 people. And so your normal NIH grant is never going to actually be able to cover what it takes to do this. It's going to take many, many people. And so again, you'll in the scientific literature, you'll see a lot of acknowledgement that this needs to change, but how do you actually do it is a hard thing. So so when Kerstin really started thinking about this and tapping into colleagues, it really honestly, one of the things I cannot stress enough about doing a study like this is it takes a lot of trust and long-term relationships. A lot of the investigators in Africa have worked together in the past. Kerstin has worked with some of the investigators in the past. And so there's a long time history of working together. And so it's really came about by people who have expertise in doing research on psychosis, spectrum disorders, and or just can broad research backgrounds that could be able to recruit. Every country is recruiting at least 8,000 people. And so that's a really big number. So a lot of it is relationships and ability to run a study like this. And then it took a couple of years. It took 2.5 years from the genesis of the idea to actually recruiting the first participant. And as of Friday, Friday was the 3rd year anniversary of the first participant recruited to the study. So the first participant was recruited in Uganda on February 11th, 3 years ago. So just quick synopsis on that. Then Lily, what was your other questions?
Well, I have one other question that I think is really relevant for you. Somebody had asked whether you're going to do similar studies in other countries, for example, in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the plan, or are you doing that already?
So we, as the group, and I'm speaking for Edith and I'm speaking for Zuki here, we have a lot on our hands. So we're not going to be doing that, but we have colleagues at the Stanley Center who are working. Really, it takes so many people to diversify genetics. So there is a team at the Stanley Center working with colleagues in Taiwan, China, and Japan, led by Dr. Hai Liang, and to do this there. So we have other people working on Asian collections, colleagues working in Mexico to try to, there's very interesting admixture populations in Mexico, and we are also, not us, but we are going to be working with people in doing similar studies in Brazil and Colombia to combine our data down the road with them. And then other groups collecting, recruiting in Sweden and Finland, which are genetically distinct, particularly Finland is genetically distinct European population. And those are the ones I can think of. There might be additional ones. Chom, if you think of anyone I left out, let me know. But there are a lot of initiatives to try to not just Africa, to try to get more representation across the world.
I think you hit all of them, Anne. The only other one that I've heard rumblings about was in Australia among Aboriginal populations there. But so each of those projects that Anne was talking about are all happening separately, but then there's a new project that I believe is going to be starting up fairly soon to start to integrate all the data from all those groups so that you can compare them against each other and have even sort of greater, it comes down to statistical power. The more people you can study in a genetic research project, the higher likelihood you have of actually discovering rare variants, rare mutations in the genome that could have significant impact and could have relationships with the diseases or traits that you're seeing in other populations. So the more people you get from more populations, the more power you have to actually discover things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see.
Great. And then maybe, and for those of us on the call who don't know the Broad Institute as well, maybe if you could, or maybe this is for you, Tom, if you can explain the relationship of Harvard, MIT, the Stanley Center, and also Edith and Zuki and how their institutions all work together with the Broad.
I feel like that's we need 2 days for that. And
Oh, okay.
no, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. But I mean, I get confused of where, particularly in Boston and Cambridge, where does one institution affiliation, like it's very fluid. You know, we have, for example, I'm technically a Harvard employee, but I sit at the Broad Institute, and my boss, Kirsten Conan, is a full professor at Harvard, but she also has appointments at the Broad Institute and at Mass General Hospital. So there is a lot of crossover just within Boston of, you know, where your affiliation is and, you know, what sort of access you get. The bulk of the funding from this study comes from the Stanley Center, which is essentially a department within the Broad Institute, devoted to psychiatric research. So what we do now have 2/3 and big NIMH grants. But that is one of the driving factors of, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there, at least for the American side, there's a lot of fluidity of people who are Broad employees, Harvard employees, and it's somewhat a little bit arbitrary. Tom, feel free to jump in if you want to just help describe sort of the nexus of the Boston world.
Sure. So the Broad in some ways is kind of a sprawling beast. So when it was founded in 2004, it was originally a jointly held research institute of MIT and Harvard, hence the name, Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. But about 5-ish years later, it split off as its own separate independent research entity. So the name still says MIT and Harvard in it, but we're actually not affiliated with either of them. However, this is where it gets murky. All of our faculty have faculty appointments at either Harvard or MIT. So, and we have various different levels of faculty. So some people have their main lab on our campus. Some people maintain a lab on our campus, but might have a lab somewhere else. And other people just have a lab elsewhere, but then come over and are active participants in the Broad community, but don't actually conduct any of the research there. So I can think of a couple of people who might have appointments at Harvard Medical School, the Broad, and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and they have offices at all three places, and they have labs at 2 of them. And how they keep all those things straight and how they get from one to the other and how they ever sleep, I will never understand. But that's kind of how Broad fits into the academic environment here. We're sort of we're sort of a meeting ground. We help bring people together from across disciplines, from across institutions, from across universities. And we give opportunities basically for folks to collaborate in ways that they wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to because of the siloed nature of a lot of academia and academic medicine.
And around the world, apparently, as well.
Yeah, so as Anne mentioned, at least through NeuroGAP, we have these relationships with the universities in the 4 countries that are participating within the NeuroGAP-Psychosis study. And those largely came out of personal relationships that Dr. Conan and her colleagues had with investigators like Edith, like Zuki, at institutions overseas. And it's the same case in many other relationships that the Broad has. We do a lot of work, for instance, with the Wellcome Sanger Trust over in the UK, mostly on cancer research. We do a lot of genetics work with institutions in Europe and Asia and in Latin America and Africa. One of our main faculty leaders on our population genetics group, he actually runs a research institute in Finland. So he splits his time between the US and Finland, bouncing back and forth all the time, although I don't know how much he's actually traveling these days. So we just try to bring people together from everywhere to all with the main theme of figuring out how do we take what we've learned from the genome, apply it to medical problems, to medical questions. How do we learn what mutations in the genome actually do? And what are the cells they affect? What are the tissues they affect? And how do they then lead to various kinds of diseases or traits that you would see in people? And then how do you develop treatments based on what you learn from the biology of those mutations?
Well, maybe with that lead in, I have a couple questions for Zuki and Edith on the science that have come in from the Q&A. So for Zuki and Edith, we have a few questions just asking whether the study that you're conducting right now, the NeuroGAP study, is it just focused on looking for genetic, I'm just trying to find the exact question. Are you taking into account other factors, or are you purely looking at genetic data in this study in terms of both of these diseases?
We know that there are multiple causes of these diseases. The causes include environmental factors, social factors, psychological factors. And in this instance, we are targeting the genetic factors because that is the one area where we know some information, but not nearly enough to make a difference to the disorders that we treat at a clinical level. So, you know, even though we're not studying those other causative factors, we know that they exist, and we know enough to at least try to do something about them. We still have a lot we don't know, which is the reason that we're actually focusing on these at the moment.
And are you also analyzing the expression of the genes, or is the goal to detect the presence of a gene or group of genes that may cause a predisposition to these diseases?
Well, if you look at where we're starting, first of all, we're starting with finding a particular group of genes that may be occurring at a higher, you know, occurrence rate as compared to chance. If you look at people with the disorders compared to people without the disorder, and you know, that will be the starting point. And then the next point would be to look at the other additional data that we've collected, which may include when the illness started, how it presented, how it reacted to particular treatments. And when we then combine what we have found in terms of information to do with that particular participant, we combine it with what we found in the genetic studies, it actually gives us a very good idea of you know, what to look at to give us an answer about when would a person express illness when they carry this gene versus when a person would carry the gene and still not have the illness. Because all of those areas at the moment are still, you know, relative unknowns. So we start off with looking for the presence of the gene. We then look at what is different in that particular gene compared to other people who may not have the illness, but we also take into consideration all the associated information that we've collected on that participant, which can be anything, to really give us, you know, more specific clues about why that particular person ended up suffering from the illness compared to other people who may still carry the same gene.
And my last question for you is, somebody has asked, what do you do with the data that you've collected? Is it made available to other institutions? And are you aggregating all the data that you're collecting across the world into one database?
Thank you. That's actually a very important question. And, you know, what is important here is that Anne might actually have even more specific information about it. But part of the reason this study is so important is because we are pooling the data, meaning we are combining a lot of the data, because that is the one way that you can actually have enough or you know, more information to be able to glean something from the data you have. Because the bigger the pool of data you have, the more possible or the more likely it may be to get to a particular answer that you're looking for. So we definitely pull the data from all the different centers in the NeuroGAP study, and it all gets collected and sent to the Broad Institute, where it is then analyzed. And at some point, we have then had an agreement as the different principal investigators that periodically it will be deposited into other data banks to literally increase the power of the information that we'll be able to get from the data.
Well, thank you, Zuki. And then I had a few questions for Edith. I know we've run long on the Q&A. but just a couple questions for Edith. So Edith, a question came in whether it's been difficult for you to recruit these patients, and how have you been able to overcome some of those hurdles?
So one, I wouldn't say that it's been very difficult to recruit the patients, because where we work, we basically manage a lot of schizophrenia and bipolar patients, because of the simple reason that in the setting where we work, a lot of mental illness that people recognize is really those. So that even if there's anxiety and depression in our setting, unfortunately, those might be seen by physicians, like the internal medicine teams, because people don't view them as mental illness. So it's not been very difficult, because like the clinic where we run, we see like about 100 patients also in a week, different patients. And so if you are to imagine that there'll be 100 different patients every week for like 3 months, because we usually give our booking like after 3 months, then it's not very, very difficult. Of course, one of the challenges that we've had is that some of these patients come from very long distances, and then public transport sometimes can be a challenge. Therefore, if you ask someone to spend another 1.5 hours to 2 hours to be involved in this study, and they need to travel back, then it becomes complicated. So that's one thing. The other important thing is that a number of our clients understand Swahili, which is our national language. There are 2 patients who may not communicate very well in Swahili, therefore we have not been able to recruit them. However, because the numbers are high, then that challenge is overcome. The other thing that we did from the beginning is recognizing that we may not have all the numbers at the institution where I work, which is Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital, Moi University Complex. What we have done is that we have engaged like satellite clinics that are further away from town where we work, so that our research assistants travel once in a week to different settings, that we are able to reach further than just the people who are coming to town. So it's been relatively easy, we would say.
And what about COVID? Has that affected you at all on the ground in terms of your work?
Yes, so as many of the people participants here would know, in the genetic study, we actually use saliva. We extract DNA from the saliva, and as many of us also know, is that COVID would be spread through droplets, and therefore it was very, very complicated, especially when COVID came. So initially we actually had to pause for collecting data, because we needed to put mechanisms in place to ensure that both the staff who is collecting the sample and also the client is protected. So we paused for a bit, and then we put mechanisms. And one of the things that we did is ensure that if the space is big enough and well aerated, then all our research assistants have to wear the protective gear, including the face shield. And so they actually collect the sample as if the sample was COVID positive. And it's improved a bit, so that initially even the number of patients who are coming to the hospital where we work were limited, because things like public transport were interrupted with, and the public vehicle had to carry fewer people, so the cost of traveling became lower. Then people are afraid, because many hospitals had really toned down in terms of their services. People just felt that maybe we may not be operating, although that was not the fact. So we had a reduction in the number of people who are coming. But after, especially there was a lot of tension, May, June, when things were, there was more anxiety than cases, if I would put it that way. But as the tension reduced, July going forward, then the clinics were normalized. One other thing that we did, because of our position in the Western Kenya region, where we are the only or the main mental health service, we intentionally didn't interrupt our mental health service. So though after the anxiety reduced, patients just resumed clinic. So COVID, initially when the anxiety was very high, affected us, but after that we've been able to continue. It was actually after July, our clinic numbers actually went back to normal.
Well, thank you. So, I mean, I think that this has all been really fascinating. And Tom, I'm really excited about the next video that you're going to air. So I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Lily. All right, so the second video, it's a compilation of several other shorter ones, kind of like the first one was. It's going to run a little bit longer, and it gets a little bit more into the details of how the study is run. And also, this is where you'll meet some of the trainees who have been participating in the study as well, and who have been learning different skill sets on the pathway to becoming psychiatric geneticists.
You have been invited to take part in a research study. Please take some time to read the information here. Please ask any question about any part of this research that you do not understand. On Wednesday is our clinic day. It's always a busy day. We go to the clinic and then we see the flagged files and those that are not flagged and which are meeting inclusion and exclusion criteria.
We have research nurses that help us in identifying the participants. We have an age that we start with, that is 18. We go through the information sheet that is having all what is required of the participant before enrolling.
So kindly have a copy of the English information sheet. Your participation is entirely voluntary and you are free to choose not to participate.
So I have to make the patient as comfortable as possible to let them know these are not exams. It helps us to ascertain if the patient is able to recognize what we have gone through.
Before NeuroGAP, there was absolutely nothing as far as looking at the genetics of mental illness in Kenya. So this is the first and the largest effort at collecting data to start understanding the genetic determinants of these severe chronic mental illnesses.
The questions are on the information. You need to know and understand why are you participating, okay?
In the long run, we expect that these results could be used, for example, to help in precision medicine, help in understanding genetics better. The patients themselves have participated in something that should make them happy because they will be part of something that may change the world.
One of the things that I really wanted to do was to give you some of the feedback on the genetic results and what is happening with the DNA samples. We have not even started looking at schizophrenia and bipolar psychosis disorders in Africa. We're only at these sort of beginning stages. And so the plan was to do genotyping. There are two different big projects that took place before us called the African Genome Variation Project and 1000 Genomes Project. They've collected samples so that if you're recruiting from Western Kenya, do the people genetically look like they're from this area? This is what we've found so far. It's all looking good and everyone it's great. So that means our quality control process is going well.
It feels good because whatever we are seeing here basically reflects the participants we see. So that means the data that we are collecting is realistic.
It looks like even though groups are geographically close together, they're all living not far from each other in Eldoret, they're actually genetically different from each other. And so it has to do with migration patterns in Africa. And so groups that were coming across Africa from west to east is one sort of language group, and other language groups going from north to south. And the explanation between these genetic differences comes down to different language families.
From what I've gathered from all this is that our samples reflect the East African template.
That's right. That's
so I
right.
think we are doing a good job.
Right.
Yeah.
Having people on the ground who understand genetics and genetic research is such an important thing, because it means, so once NeuroGAP-Psychosis is done with this data collection, then it's not all scrap and go. It means we can continue this now, because then we have people who can manipulate data in cloud. We have biostatisticians who understand. We have epidemiologists who understand it. We even have ethics people who actually understand genetic studies. So we're going to have these people in our committees, in our institutions. And so that means the next time we have another NeuroGAP-Psychosis, then we don't have to have everybody brought from elsewhere. So I think that's the overall benefit of doing these things and having a training and capacity in leaving people, not just with the knowledge, but also with the ability to do it themselves. So I want to be that person that is in that group that helps people understand. Now we are talking about genes, inheritance, and so we're going to start to have science credibility in terms of mental illnesses.
I've been having a passion in science since I was in my primary grade, and I've always had the desire to extend it and be able to go further with it, and be able to maybe be a research fellow at the end of it all. I had some background in molecular biology, so when that came up as I was really interested to know what's the science behind the psychotic patients now, because it's becoming common within our population here. I had already started being involved in the program, especially in the extraction part, because the lab was contracted to provide services for them. I got thrilled with the NeuroGAP project itself. With this research, I hope it will materialize to give something substantial. And maybe within the five more years, maybe if all goes well, maybe apply for PhD and maybe further studies on that.
Ginger maybe is the global initiative for neuropsychiatric genetics education in research. It is an initiative actually that is aiming at giving equity to African researchers to be able to conduct large-scale genomics research in Africa. I think they're already creating a big impact because they are training the first slot of neuropsychiatric genetists in Uganda and giving us skills that we need to be able to conduct neuropsychiatric research. I think that is a very big impact to Uganda. Looking at how I would want to contribute to science in Uganda and Africa in general, I would want to understand the biological factors that underlie mental disorders in the African cultural context. That would be my desire, how I would want to contribute to neuropsychiatric genetics in Uganda and Africa in general.
One of the long-term impacts would be leaving behind infrastructure that will enable Africans to be able to participate in the global search for answers in mental health.
Any research is good for mental health because then it starts putting evidence out there on what is happening in mental health and what can be done. And then coming down to the genetic studies is that when interventions are developed, then we'll not be wondering whether we were a part of it or whether it applies to us like we have always wondered, but we'll confidently say that we were represented in that analysis.
We are making it a science problem, so it should have a science solution. Having people now understand that it comes from, it's like we are tall or short because our parents are tall or short, then our brains are just gonna be like our parents' brains. And so if there's something wrong down the generations, then it's gonna come to somebody else along the generation. So that, I think, should be encouraged even in like schools, so that people start to understand this is an organ. And we inherit it, just like we inherit our height, our skin color, our hairs.
We know that there are also other things like environmental factors that play a role in the development of psychosis. So it would really be very important for us to study the neurogenetics of psychosis.
Working in collaboration with other institutions like the Harvard School of Public Health and Broad Institute will enable us quickly achieve our goal, because our resources will be brought together, our minds will be brought together, and we shall walk the path together and becomes faster in finding solutions.
It's a beautiful collaboration. It's a prototype. It's one that people should use going forward.
I hope that the work that we're doing will contribute, even if it's a little bit, to the discovery of new diagnostic techniques and discovery of new treatments for the illnesses that cause a huge burden of suffering to a significant proportion of the people on this planet. So this is my hope for a project like NeuroGAP.
That's the show. Lily, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom. I mean, this has been really amazing. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate. I think now, when I didn't quite appreciate before, the power of studying data and conducting science worldwide, and looking at different countries and looking at specific illnesses like bipolar disease and schizophrenia in other countries. So I think that that's really powerful, and I'm understanding that the information that you're collecting is going to be very valuable and powerful in terms of progressing the science on both diseases. And with that, I really would like, Anne, maybe if you could say a few words about where the study is right now, where it's going, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the goal is to get to 35,000 participants. And so half of those are cases and half of them are controls. So the cases are the people that have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar, and the controls are people who don't have a history of that. So we're going to keep recruiting. As of last week, I think we're almost at 23,000 participants across the 4 countries. And so we'll definitely be recruiting for the next year, probably until June 2022, and trying to get as close to that target. As some of the people have asked in the chat, how's COVID affected this? And it's really slowed down recruitment for many reasons. But so trying to get as close to 35,000 people as we can. And then also the process of sequencing the data will start so that we can do the analysis.
That's fantastic. And do you have any other remaining thoughts that you wanted to convey to the audience, about the study? And
I think for me, it's really that if anyone's interested in this kind of work, it cannot happen solely by people in America sitting in their labs. You really need to have experts and superstars like Dr. Kwoba and Dr. Zingela who know their contexts, who know their cultures, who really know how recruitment happens on their sites and how, you know, if psychosis is manifest differently, they know how to get things done. And so you really need to start working, you know, you need to build strong relationships. You really need to have your collaborators have a seat at the table. And that's the most important thing to have any long-term complicated study be successful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Maybe for Zuki and Edith, maybe starting with Zuki, if you wanted to say any final words to the audience, understanding that this is really going to, I think, impact and change the world, way that young girls think about science, you know, to think about it globally, which I think is really fascinating. If maybe you could speak to that, and if you have any advice for young girls who are interested in science.
Thank you, Lily. I think the first thing I want to say is because I'm a clinician researcher, that is, I'm working in the clinical field and also collecting data, which will then be analyzed in these, you know, very complicated ways. I then value what we would sometimes call translational research. So this is the kind of research that you may do in the lab, but will ultimately make a difference to how we practice medicine. And of course, for a long time, there was this belief that real research only occurs in a lab. What we've found over the years is that in order for the research to make a significant and tangible difference in the clinical setting, it actually has to have both the lab part and the clinical part. I'm highlighting that because you might find some young women who are interested in science who might think, oh, I want to be a doctor. Being a doctor also includes, you know, focusing on science in terms of, you know, the disorders that result and how to treat them. But what is also important is being in that clinical setting does not limit you just to that. You can actually extend your interest to include research, the kind that Anne is referring to, in such a way that you are able to have both worlds. So my encouragement to young girls out there is, first of all, think about how you can really nurture your research, and whatever angle you come from, whether it's the angle of the lab or the angle of the clinical side, know that the part you play is going to be important in offering us answers to a lot of the questions that we don't really have answers to at the moment. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful, Zuki. Thank you very much. Edith, would love to hear your thoughts too on the same questions.
Thank you. I think the one thing I want to say to young girls is that it's possible. I think for a long time, we believe that only men should be involved in science, but over time that has been proven wrong, despite the challenges that comes with things like childbirth and family. You have time for what you value, and therefore if you value science, those challenges should not really discourage you, and that's true especially for many of us who work on this side of the world where there's not even protected time for research, but with purpose that we want to be part of them of history. When the books are written, the complete draft, remember we said that the human genome project draft was just a draft, and soon, because now there has been diversity and inclusion of more people, when the final draft or the final copy of the human book or the book of human life is written, we'll be part of it. And we want to encourage the women not to be discouraged by anything, that is possible, and it's possible to balance, because what a man can do, a woman can do it.
I love that. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. Tom, I wanted to turn it over to you because I know that we've been working together on a number of initiatives, but would love to hear your closing thoughts as well, and what you have to say to young girls who might be interested in pursuing both science and medicine.
So on the second question, I think everything that Edith and Zuki just said perfectly encapsulates it. I don't really have anything to add, except, you know, there's so much possibility out there, and it's just a matter of finding your passions and understanding where you want to go with it and following through on it. Closing thoughts beyond that. I would just say, it's been a truly a pleasure and an honor working with Anne and Edith and Zuki and all their collaborators, both on this side of the Atlantic and in Africa over the last couple of years. This was a story that took a long time to tell. I think Anne first approached us in, I want to say like the spring of 2018. And it took a lot of conversation to actually get us to go over and do the trip. It took about 1.5 years and then another year of writing and producing and editing and whatnot to actually get everything you saw today together and out in front of the public. So this was a long-term project, involved a lot of people, and just shout out to everybody, especially at Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital and at Budapika Hospital, which was the one in Uganda that we shot at, for all of their efforts and time that they took with us and opening their doors to us when Russ and I went over to shoot this content.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say thank you to all for participating in this event. After this event closes, I think there's some remaining Q&A, and we'll just answer that, after the event officially ends. And for everybody who's watching right now, we have been working at Young Women Bio with the Broad on a number of initiatives. We are going to be putting this video out on our YouTube channel, so it's available for everybody to watch as well. We also will be putting a playlist of Broad videos on our YouTube channel as well, and that should be up, within the next couple of weeks. So we're hoping to get that up as soon as we can. We really think that obviously the Broad is one of the top institutions in science. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be working with you to help, outreach to young girls. So thank you all for your time. And to everybody who's been watching, thank you. I hope that this has been very interesting to you. And, please check back in to see both what we're doing, at Young Women in Bio, and also what Tom and the Broad is doing for science education and communications at the Broad website. So thank you, everybody.